Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. My best friend Sarah made some questionable decisions recently. She sent some private pictures to a guy she thought she could trust, even though she only knew his first name, Jake, his online username, and vague details about where he lived and worked. He wasn't from our country, but mentioned he'd be traveling near us for work soon, and they had tentatively planned to meet up. When Sarah noticed some red flags and decided to cancel their plans, Jake threatened to publish her pictures online. I happen to be a lawyer, and I wasn't about to let this slide. "Sarah, don't worry," I told her over the phone. "I'll handle this jerk." "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What if he actually posts them?" "Trust me," I replied. "He won't get the chance." I started digging. Using the photos Jake had sent Sarah that could potentially identify him, I began my search. His online handle led me to a TikTok page, which then pointed me towards an Instagram account with his full name. From there, I found a LinkedIn profile that matched his workplace, the same one visible in a picture he'd sent wearing a company-branded polo. A few more searches got me the email addresses of the CEO, VP of HR, Operations Manager, and PR Manager at Jake's company. I drafted an email on behalf of my client, attaching screenshots of Jake's threats about revenge porn, snippets of their conversation showing his username alongside that picture of him in company gear, and links proving his identity. I also included photos he'd sent of his motorcycle with the license plate visible as further proof. To really drive the point home, I added screenshots of Jake discussing a recent workplace incident, time-stamped conversations about having sex with an ex at his office, and his plans to do the same with Sarah. The cherry on top, a picture he'd sent showing his work laptop with his entire Outlook calendar and some juicy proprietary information, which he'd shared to prove he was busy, along with other workplace photos featuring non-consenting employees. I informed his employer that I'd be forwarding all this information to their local law enforcement. Since Jake had mentioned traveling to the United States soon, I also planned to alert the FBI, as his threats against a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil constituted a federal crime. "Should you proceed with his employment and his upcoming U.S. trip," I wrote, "I will ensure on behalf of my client that federal law enforcement greets him upon arrival," and I wasn't bluffing. One of the assistant U.S. attorneys in our region is an old law school buddy of mine. With his license plate number in hand, I knew where Jake lived. "I'll be contacting your local authorities tomorrow," I added at the end of the email. After hitting send, I called Sarah to update her. "It's done," I said. "That creep won't know what hit him." "What exactly did you do?" she asked, a mix of curiosity and concern in her voice. I chuckled. "Let's just say his job, reputation, and freedom are all on very thin ice right now. You dumb mother ducker, thinking you were hiding behind anonymity, thinking you could threaten my friend. It took me 45 minutes to potentially destroy your entire life." As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Jake thought he held all the cards, but he had no idea who he was messing with. Sometimes, being a lawyer with a particular set of skills comes in handy, especially when it comes to protecting the people you care about. The next one is an entitled people story. I never thought I'd be telling a story about airplane drama, but here we are. Last month, I was flying from New York to London for an important business meeting. My company had splurged on a business class ticket, which was a real treat. I was looking forward to actually getting some sleep on the overnight flight for once. Everything started out normal enough. I boarded the plane, found my seat, 14A, a nice window spot, and got settled in. I was just getting comfy when this guy in a fancy suit comes up to me. "Excuse me, you're in my seat," he says, all snooty-like. I double-check my ticket. "Nope, 14A, this is definitely my seat." He huffs and puffs a bit, then stomps off towards the front of the cabin. I figured that was the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. A few minutes later, fancy suit guy is back. This time, he's got a flight attendant with him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move to seat 23C, the flight attendant says. "Why? This is my assigned seat," I reply, confused. "There's been a change in the seating arrangements. 23C is actually a better seat. It's in the exit row," she explains, not quite meeting my eyes. Now, I'm not a confrontational guy, but something felt off here. "I'm sorry, but I paid for this specific seat. I'd like to stay here unless there's a real reason I need to move." The flight attendant looks uncomfortable. Fancy suit guy is getting red in the face. "Look, buddy," he snaps. "That seat belongs to my boss. She always sits there. Just move already." "Ah, now we're getting to it." I stand my ground. "I understand, but this is my assigned seat. If your boss wants to sit here, she should have booked it in advance." The flight attendant tries to smooth things over. "Sir, perhaps we could offer you some extra miles or an onboard credit as compensation for the inconvenience?" I shake my head. I appreciate the offer, but I really need to get some sleep on this flight. I have an important meeting right after we land. I'd like to stay in my assigned seat. Fancy suit guy looks like he's about to burst a blood vessel. He storms off again, muttering under his breath. I thought that would be the end of it. The flight attendant apologized for the hassle and I settled back in. But a few minutes later, all hell broke loose. This woman comes marching up the aisle like she owns the place. Designer clothes, way too much jewelry, and a scowl that could curdle milk. Ladies and gentlemen, we have our Karen. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieks, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "I always sit in 14A. Who do you think you are?" I take a deep breath. "Ma'am, I'm the person who was assigned this seat. I paid for it, and I'd like to stay here." Karen's face goes from red to purple. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Karen Entitledson, CEO of Megacorp Industries. I've flown over 1,000,000 miles with this airline. That seat is mine." By now, we've got quite the audience. Other passengers are rubbernecking to watch the show. I'm starting to get embarrassed, but I'm also getting annoyed. "Miss Entitledson, I understand you're used to sitting here, but the fact is, I booked this seat fair and square. If it's so important to you, you should have reserved it in advance." Karen looks like she's about to spontaneously combust. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'll have your job for this. What's your name? Who do you work for?" I'm about to answer when the head flight attendant and the pilot show up. Great, just what we need. More people involved in this circus. "What seems to be the problem here?" the pilot asks, looking stern. Karen launches into a tirade about how she always sits in 14A, how she's a super special platinum diamond whatever member, and how I need to be removed from the plane immediately. The pilot listens patiently, then turns to me. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass, please?" I hand it over. He looks at it, nods, and hands it back. "Miss Entitledson, I'm sorry, but this gentleman is correct. This is his assigned seat. We can't force him to move." Karen's jaw drops. But I'm Karen Entitledson? Don't you know who I am?" The pilot sighs. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. But we have to follow airline policy. If you'd like, we can try to find you another business class seat, or we can offer you a spot in first class if there's availability." For a moment I thought Karen's head might actually explode, but then she gets this calculating look in her eye. "Fine," she says in a sickly sweet voice. "I'll take the first class seat, and I expect a full refund for this flight plus compensation for my distress." The pilot agrees to pass her request to customer service. Karen shoots me one last death glare before swanning off to first class, fancy suit guy trailing behind her like a lost puppy. As they're leaving, I overhear Karen stage whisper to fancy suit guy. "Find out everything you can about that man. I want him blacklisted from every airline, hotel, and rental car company in the world." I'll admit that sent a chill down my spine. This woman clearly had money and connections. Could she really mess up my life over an airplane seat? The rest of the flight was uneventful, but I couldn't fully relax. I kept thinking about Karen's threat. As soon as we landed, I called my boss and filled him in on what happened. He told me not to worry and that he'd handle it. Turns out my boss is pretty well connected himself. He made some calls and found out that Karen had a history of pulling stunts like this. The airline was fed up with her behavior but had been afraid to stand up to her because of her company's big corporate account. My boss got in touch with the airline's CEO directly. He explained the situation and pointed out that Karen's behavior was a liability for both the airline and her own company. The airline CEO agreed and promised to take action. A week later, I got an email from the airline. They apologized for the incident, thanked me for standing my ground, and offered me a free business class ticket to anywhere in the world. They also informed me that Karen Entitledson had been permanently banned from the airline for repeated violations of their passenger code of conduct. But it gets better. Remember how Karen wanted me blacklisted? Well, word of her behavior spread through the corporate grapevine. Turns out a lot of people were sick of her entitled attitude. Within a month, she was forced to resign as CEO of Megacorp Industries. The board of directors cited behavior unbecoming of a corporate leader as the reason. So in the end, Karen's attempt to bully me out of my seat backfired spectacularly. She lost her airline status, her job, and probably a good chunk of her reputation. And me? I'm planning a nice vacation to Hawaii, courtesy of that free ticket. The moral of the story? Stand up for yourself, even against big shots like Karen. You never know. You might end up winning in the long run. The next one is a petty revenge story. I feel like I need to say something like, long-time reader, first-time participator. So to start it off, I will say that I am a decent driver. There have definitely been times when I made a risky move and I always acknowledge it, but for the most part I know my limits and will drive accordingly. Now to the good stuff. So after a long day, I am driving home and the turn for the one-lane road is coming up. I knew to make it, I had to speed up to go over 2 lanes to make that right turn, but I waited until I saw the headlights of the car in the lane next to me in my rearview mirror before I went over. They also turned right. So this one-lane road can be windy and usually high beams need to be on to get through it safely. So when the guy behind me turned their high beams on, I thought, hey, no worries, I have mine on, you can turn yours off, which they did, until 5 seconds later when they turned it back on, and 5 seconds later turned it off, and so on and so forth until I realized they were doing it on purpose. Well, after reflecting on my actions, I realized this Good Samaritan who decided to inform me of my wrongdoings was correct. And to show my appreciation, I decided to fix the error of my ways. Not only did I slow down to driving the speed limit on a longer road he couldn't pass me on, I even went down to 5 miles below it, after making sure no one was behind him, because I really needed to get my speeding under control. It turned out that they were behind me for the next 10 minutes right before I got home, and they even did the headlight thing to me when there were other cars driving towards us on the other side. So after witnessing that, I didn't feel too guilty about my actions. All in all, I will say 10/10 would highly recommend I may just be petty the next time someone decides to duck around with me. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I'm a clinical nurse in physical rehabilitation in Australia. I will never forget a lot of our residents, junior doctors, for being brilliant, but one resident I will never forget because he was awful. One fateful Thursday, I overheard him complaining to the consultant and registrar, "It's boring here, there's nothing to do." I know it's not the most high-energy place to be, and it's definitely not for everyone, but I thought that was a little rude and snide, to say the least. This same doctor, only a day or 2 later, was asked to rechart a PRN, as needed, pain order for a patient who was having a lot of pain for acute gout. We had already had to contact the emergency department medical registrar, we call them the ED MedReg for short, overnight the night before for a phone order for her pain relief, as there were no spaces left on her last PRN order, and, at the time, we did not have a doctor on call overnight at the campus I work at. Instead of recharting the order, the resident, who, remember, was apparently so bored and had so little to do that he complained both the registrar and the consultant about it, instead chose to write a sticky note telling the nurses to just call the ED Med Reg for a phone order if she has pain overnight, and stuck it on top of the patient's previous PRN pain relief order. It would have taken him less time to rewrite the order, not to mention as if the ED Med Reg doesn't have enough work to do in the literal emergency department. Seeing that note as the night duty nurse on charge and remembering that snide little remark of his made my blood boil. But it was, of course, nighttime and long past the resident's knock-off time. So when the poor patient inevitably had pain overnight, I had no choice but to call. The ED MedReg just so happened to be the same doctor as the night before and, rightfully, was a little confused and slightly annoyed. We were calling for the same phone order 2 nights in a row when surely the treating team should have written a new order during the day. He asked whether we had asked them to do so, and I told him about the sticky note and even read it to him. I remember a beat of silence on the other end of the phone before he said, "Right," before giving me the phone order. I thanked him, apologized for having to disturb him, and went to help my patient. When I came on the next night, lo and behold, the resident had written up a new PRN order. In fact, we never saw a sticky note like that again, and PRN orders were rewritten in a timely manner. I don't know if that doctor ever got spoken to about his smug little sticky note, but I like to think he got a good talking to. Just because my patients aren't in ICU or ED doesn't make them and their health unimportant. They're still in hospital and deserve proper inpatient health care. The next one is an entitled people's story. Some backstory that's relevant to the story. In December of 2020, my father agreed to put his mother into a nursing home to protect his sister, my aunt, from an elder abuse investigation and getting my grandmother moved into state care. Because of my aunt's negligence, my grandmother had been hospitalized 3 times in 2 months. Once for a severe UTI, another time for an infected wound because my aunt secured my grandmother's diaper with duct tape, and the final time because of second-degree burns after my aunt left a heating pad on my grandmother's back overnight. Ironically, in October 2021, my aunt would end up in a nursing home after she burned herself with a heating pad, then didn't get medical treatment until the burn was badly infected. In January 2022, my grandmother passed away at the age of 94 years old. In my grandparents' will, they spilt their estate between their two children 50-50. However, because neither my father nor aunt was on the deed to my grandparents' house, it was signed over to a probate lawyer who would be tasked with selling the house. When my father started going through his mother's affairs in February 2022, he discovered that the state was on the verge of taking the house because the only bills my aunt bothered paying were the electric and cable bills, and she hadn't paid property taxes since December 2020. My father also discovered that there were two massive liens on the house totaling almost $200,000. One from the nursing home my grandmother had been in because my aunt hadn't paid them either. The other because my aunt convinced my grandmother to take home equity loan out on the house so she could buy a car. Initially, she was only supposed to take what she needed for the car, or roughly $6,000. However, my aunt went behind my grandmother's back and would end up taking the full $100,000 the bank offered them. My aunt had been able to co-sign for the loan, so she was authorized to take the full amount. She also never made any of the monthly payments on the loan because she legitimately thought loans were money banks just give people for free, no strings attached. My aunt never told anyone what she did with the remaining $94,000, but the rest of the family is suspecting that she gambled it away at local casinos. My aunt was also given full access to my grandmother's bank account, which she had almost complete drained before my grandmother passed, meaning my father had to pay any outstanding bills out of his own pocket, though he was eventually reimbursed by the lawyer. Some point between late January 2022 and March 2022, in an attempt to buy herself some time to recover enough to leave the nursing home and thinking that the house couldn't be sold if someone was living in it, my aunt convinced one of her friends to move into my grandmother's vacant house unbeknownst to my father and the lawyer. As you can imagine, things got messy when my father found out. Initially, my aunt told my father that the man was there to take care of her two cats. However, even after my aunt was court-ordered to sign her two cats over to my father due to neglect and abuse, the man refused to leave. Both cats have been treated and rehomed and are doing well. We eventually found out he had broken his lease, moved out of his apartment, and had nowhere else to go except his and my aunt's daughter's house, and who adamantly refused to let her father move in with her. Around April, my parents started to deep clean the disgustingly dirty house with the man still living there, and he did everything in his power to obstruct my parents' efforts. He'd call up claiming he was sick with COVID, which my parents almost always called his bluff on since he was physically disabled and never left the house, nor had anyone but my parents visit. One day he told my mother, "Well, Sharon, EA, said we'd be able to live here forever, and that my father didn't have the balls to kick me out." Well, my mom told my father what had been said, and the very next day, my father gave the man an ultimatum. My father told the man, either you leave on your own by May 1st, or I'll have you evicted. The man chose the eviction route because my aunt told him, they can't legally evict a disabled person, and he believed her. He ended up having to move in with his daughter, who is no longer speaking to my aunt because my aunt has ruined that woman's livelihood on multiple occasions, but that's a whole other story. However, before he left the house, per my aunt's orders, he stole several valuable pieces of jewelry, including a box of rings that had been willed to her cousins. We were able to get the stolen jewelry back in late 2023 after the probate lawyer had to send police to retrieve it. Which is another doozy of a story. Because of the whole squatter incident, we missed a massive housing boom where houses were selling for significantly more than what they were worth. And the house was put on the market during a slump, and the house sold for almost $150,000 less than what it was worth. And it led to another lengthy legal battle with my aunt because she refused to sell or throw out any of her furniture, in another attempt to buy enough time to leave the nursing home, until she was court-ordered to do so. Given what the house sold for and deducting the lien from the home equity loan, the lien the nursing home put on the house had been dismissed by a judge. The end, my father ended up with just under $60,000, while my aunt ended up with just under $50,000. My aunt got less because the probate lawyer charged her more than he charged my father because she was the one who had drawn things out for so long. Around that time, my aunt had been deemed unfit to make decisions for herself by a judge and several of her doctors, and ended up signing her half of the inheritance to my father to avoid losing it to the nursing home she was in. My aunt passed away on August 1st at the age of 68 from multi-organ failure caused by years of heavy smoking, ignoring her diabetes, and refusing to consent to a surgery that would have likely saved her life. We didn't have a funeral for her. We simply had her cremated, and her ashes along with pictures and other personal belongings were given to her older daughter. My aunt's younger daughter tried to sue my father for the rest of her mother's inheritance, but the suit was quickly dropped, since the money my aunt had inherited after her mother's death had already been signed over to my father, so my aunt's daughter had no right to it. Our one saving grace in this whole fiasco was that my aunt was in a nursing home for the entire process, Otherwise, it would have been significantly messier. There's a lot I didn't go into for the sake of not typing out an almost literal novel, but I'll gladly elaborate on anything I can. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.